Hi everyone, welcome to Free Prep Hour. My name is Allie Bell and I'll be your instructor today. I put a note in the chat inviting you to introduce yourselves. So I'd love to hear a little bit about you, where you're from, and when you're taking the LSAT, when you get a moment to share that in the chat. And while you're doing that, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. So I am an LSAT and GMAT instructor with Manhattan Prep. I have been teaching with Manhattan Prep for going on 11 years now, so it's been quite some time. I am also the manager of training and an instructor manager there. And I regularly host these free prep hours. So I'm excited to be meeting all of you today. I love the free prep hours because they're an opportunity to dive deep into an important topic on the LSAT, and also for me to meet some new LSAT students from all over the world. Jamie, I'm so glad you like the videos on YouTube. That's great. For those of you who are new to this, all of the free prep hours, mine and those taught by other instructors, end up on YouTube as recordings. So you're welcome to check them out and see what other content can be helpful to you. I see folks taking the LSAT in February, April. Heather, that is wonderful. I am confident that you will survive, and I admire you taking on so much. Deborah, thank you for helping with the pronunciation. Okay, you've got your LSAT coming up very soon. Okay, good. You've still got a couple of weeks to work on the timed sections. I'm glad you're getting going with that. Hi, Arushi, welcome from Hong Kong. Hi, John. Good to have you here. All right, and hi, Laura. Welcome from Hawaii. Oh, how neat. We have people from everywhere. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. So just for those of you who are looking for additional free LSAT content, you have a couple more options. As I mentioned, there are quite a few free prep hour YouTube videos available now on our MPrep LSAT channel. You are also very welcome to come to one of our LSAT session ones for free. As a trial student, you get 3 hours of instruction on logic games, logical reasoning, and LSAT fundamentals. It's a particularly great opportunity if you're just starting out with your prep and you'd like some orientation and a sense of what a class might be like as you weigh your options. For those of you who are more interested in an asynchronous option where it might be hard for you to commit to attending class at the same time every week, we have a great on-demand course called Lsat Interact. It's taught by some of our strongest veteran instructors, and it is very comprehensive of everything that's covered on the LSAT. In fact, it covers the same general material that is in the course, and it does so in an adaptive video format. So you will be sort of taught a lesson, given a real LSAT problem to try, and then you input your answer and you actually get different personalized feedback depending on the answer that you selected. So it's a really cool option for those of you who'd like a little bit more flexibility in your LSAT studies. So today we are going to, definitely taking it in a few days, awesome. All right, so today we're going to do something that I hope is helpful for everyone, regardless of when you are taking the LSAT and how long you've been studying. We are going to focus on what I think of as the VIP of the logical reasoning section, which is the conclusion of an argument. And I call this the VIP because it's just so incredibly important to so many different types of questions in logical reasoning. So today we're going to briefly introduce what a conclusion is and how we find it. That part of the lesson is geared towards those of you who are just starting out. And then we're going to dive into 3 different types of questions. We're going to look at questions that directly ask you for the conclusion of an argument or to name another part of the argument, and those we call structure questions. We're going to look at questions where you need to find the conclusion of the argument in order to talk about what might be problematic with it. Those are assumption family questions. And then we're going to talk about one question type that a lot of people dread, but that I love, which is matching questions. And those questions are great opportunities for you to really exploit what you notice about the conclusion of the argument. So I hope for those of you who are just starting out with your LSAT studies, today will help orient you to a really fundamental skill of identifying the conclusion in an argument. And for those of you who are further along in your studies, hopefully today will be a good review with some really challenging logical reasoning questions that kind of run the gamut of what you'll see on the test. So let's go ahead and get started. You will have opportunities to interact with me throughout this session, and those will mostly come from the chat. So there will be times where I'll put up a poll or ask you to answer a question, but I just want to invite you all to also use the chat along the way to ask questions or share comments at any point. And I get a little notification when you say something, so I'll try to keep an eye on that. Deborah, thank you for asking, will you get these notes after class? We don't send out the slides, but this whole lesson does get posted to YouTube a couple of weeks after it's made, so you can keep an eye out for that. You'll also see in the bottom right-hand corner of the slides, when we start getting to questions, you'll see what practice tests they come from and what number they are. So if you want to go look them up afterwards, you're welcome to do that. All right, so let's start with what is this conclusion thing that I think is the VIP of the LR section. So I'm going to give you a sample, very simple argument based on real life. So I happen to need a new quarantine hobby. So welcome any ideas that all of you have. But I made this argument about it. Allie needs a new quarantine hobby. So she should get a pet salamander. In this very simple argument, my conclusion is, so she should get a pet salamander. Please take a moment to tell me in the chat, how would someone know that that's the conclusion of this argument? What makes it a conclusion? Can you walk a salamander? Good question. Great, so the word so is a conclusion indicator. It means therefore. Good. Anything else about this that makes it a conclusion? Love it, yeah. So I see some folks thinking about the meaning relationship. Sandrine saying it answers the question why. Arushi pointing out we've got support from the premise for that statement. Yeah, and John pointing out the same. Good. And that's really what this word so is doing. It's a shortcut for the idea that this first statement is giving us a reason that this second statement is true. So sometimes we'll have a helpful word like so to lead us to know that that's the conclusion. But sometimes we could have the same argument written without the word so, and it can be a little tougher to find the conclusion then. So we then need to think about what statement here is giving support and what statement is receiving support. Conclusions always receive support from something else in the argument. So they are selfish. They don't give out support. They don't help to prove other things true. Instead, everything is assembled there to help prove the conclusion true. There are a couple of other important criteria for something to be a conclusion. First, a conclusion that, sorry, I'm looking at the chat. I'll answer those questions in just a second. A conclusion is not going to be a fact. So for example, I would not have the sky is blue as a fact or as a conclusion in an argument, because a conclusion on the LSAT has to be potentially debatable. There has to be some room for it to possibly be wrong. So believe it or not, Like maybe there are some reasons that I shouldn't get a pet salamander, and that makes this a possible conclusion. And then of course it has to have support from something else in the argument. All right, I saw a question which was, can you all send your responses for all to see? Great idea. If you change the to when you send a chat to all panelists and attendees, I believe that will send it to everyone. If you're just sending to all panelists, then that's just me, and I'll see it that way. All right. So when you are just starting out with breaking down arguments and logical reasoning, you may find it helpful to acquaint yourself with some of those words that indicate relationships on the LSAT. So here is a list of words that indicate that a statement is providing support. And the lingo that we typically use for that in the LSAT world is those statements are premises, so those supportive statements, those reasons why. And then we've got a list of words here that are frequently used on the LSAT to indicate a conclusion statement, so to link something from the premise to the conclusion. Feel free to take a screenshot of this list of words. It's a little long for you to write down in a short span of time, but certainly very helpful when you're first starting out in learning how to identify conclusions. With that, I want us to go ahead and dive right in to getting some practice. So we're going to start with a couple of real questions from practice test 65 on the LSAT. And we're going to start with a question that really highlights the conclusion as the VIP. So there's this question type that we call identify the conclusion. And it's exactly what it sounds like. Basically, they just want you to find the sentence that is the conclusion of the argument and then match it to the answer choice that best expresses it. So I'm going to give you a chance to try that in a moment, but I want to give you one word of warning. A lot of people, when they do this type of question, think that their job is to summarize the argument. And it makes sense, because a lot of times that's the closest similar task that we've been asked to do in the past on SATs or GREs or other similar standardized tests. Summarizing the argument is not your job on the LSAT. Your job for this type of question is to find the single sentence in the argument. It should be something you could physically underline. That is the conclusion, that is the final supported claim, and match it as closely as possible in meaning to the answer choices. All right, so let's give this a try. I'm gonna hop off camera for about 2 minutes to let you work on your own, and then I'll be back and I'll put up a poll for you to tell me what you think the answer is here. All right, it's been about 2 minutes. So I am going to launch a poll and ask you to take a moment to select an answer. If you're still thinking, it's still really helpful to me if you just kind of tell me what answer you're leaning towards right now. And this will be anonymous. Great, I'm seeing a lot of participation in the poll. That's really helpful, thank you. I'm gonna end the polling now and talk through this process with you. So the first thing I want you to reflect on is when you were working through this question, did you pick a particular sentence or a phrase from this text that you would say is the conclusion? If so, awesome. That's exactly what you should be doing. And I'd love to know what it was. So can you give me the first 3 words of the sentence that you chose as the conclusion in the chat? Ooh, interesting. Okay. So I see a couple of different sentences that are showing up a lot. One is the sentence that starts with "for this reason," and one is the sentence that starts with "but recent research." And I also saw a request, thank you for asking this, to reiterate what's the importance of finding the conclusion. So we're going to see this in action on a variety of different question types. For this particular question type, the importance of finding the conclusion is that that's exactly what we're being asked to do to get this question correct. They're asking us to identify what is the conclusion that's drawn in this argument. And as we move through different question types, I'll be sure to explain why the conclusion is so important for those question types as well. So we've got 2 great options here for a potential conclusion. What I like about them both is that they both express potentially debatable opinions. So a prediction is a potentially debatable opinion. And then we've got a response to that prediction, that this is unlikely, also a potentially debatable opinion. So the conclusion that we're looking for on these types of arguments is the conclusion that the person who wrote this argument believes. So in this case, that's the geographer. And we want to say, well, which of these is the opinion that the geographer would own? And in this case, it is this sentence that I'm going to highlight in blue, but recent research shows this prediction is unlikely to be borne out. There's 2 major ways that I know that this is the geographer's opinion. The first is that the opinion expressed here is attributed to other people. So the geographer is describing many early discussions, but not saying like, I was part of these discussions, or this is what I believe. Typically, when we see an opinion attributed to someone else, so so-and-so believes or people say, that's not the opinion of the person who is speaking. They're trying to make it clear, this is what other people think. The other thing that helps here is a classic LSAT argument structure, which is to start off by sharing some background information and context of what other people think, and then to say, but, and that but generally indicates, here's what I think about this topic. But, those people are wrong. And so that's what's happening here. We get a bunch of context and what we call opposing viewpoints up here. And then the geographer themselves comes in and says, but this is what I think the recent research shows. No caveat, it's just, this is what the research shows, that this prediction is unlikely to be borne out. So a Ruchika question, if there is A but B, should the conclusion include a bit of both? Great question. So when the conclusion refers to a previous sentence, oftentimes the correct answer will incorporate some of that sentence. So for example, in this conclusion, the phrasing is this prediction is unlikely to be borne out. So it's very likely that the correct answer choice, instead of using the language this prediction, is going to actually sub in the idea from the previous sentence that this is referencing. So this prediction is a reference to global warming causing more frequent and intense tropical storms. So I might anticipate an answer would say something like, global warming is actually unlikely to cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. What the answer doesn't have to do is it doesn't have to balance the two sides. So it doesn't have to say, some people think, global warming will have this effect, but the author disagrees. It just needs to express the but part of the author's opinion. This might include like a language or an idea from the previous sentence if the author's opinion refers to that, if that makes sense. Let me know, Arushi, if you want any further clarification on that. All right, so we have our conclusion isolated. Now we are deciding of these answer choices, which one is the most accurate expression of that conclusion. And we care most about meaning rather than the particular sort of like exactly matching the words that are written here. So we want the meaning of the answer choice to match this idea. So let's take a pass through the answer choices. My first round through answers on logical reasoning, I am generally selecting whether I want to keep an answer or get rid of it. And then I do a second pass where I make a more final decision. So I'm going to bring out my X tool and see which answer choices I want to get rid of on my first pass. All right, so A, tropical storms are especially likely to form over warm ocean surfaces. So I'm going to get rid of this on my first pass, and I'll show you why. This information is up here in the context or background part of this argument. So because it is pretty far away, it's in a different part of the argument than what my conclusion is talking about, I'm going to get rid of it pretty quickly for that reason. Answer choice B, contrary to early discussions, global warming is not the only factor affecting the frequency and intensity. This I'll keep for now since it sort of expresses a contrast and does seem to kind of refute these early discussions. C, if global warming were reversed, tropical storms would be less frequent and less intense. This one I'm going to get rid of on my first pass through because it doesn't have anything in this argument that talks about what would happen if global warming were reversed. We just have a conversation about what are the effects of global warming going to be. D, instabilities in wind flow will negate the effect of global warming on the formation of tropical storms. I'll hang on to this one too, since I see instabilities in wind flow right next to my conclusion. I know we're talking about tropical storms. And then E, global warming will probably not produce more frequent and intense tropical storms. So I'm going to keep that one as well. So now I'm going to go back through my answer choices and I'm going to try to attend more closely to how well do these match up with exactly what my conclusion said. And I'm going to pay attention to two things in particular. I want to make sure that it's not going very far beyond just the conclusion. And I also want to make sure that the language that is used matches the degree or sort of the intensity of the conclusion. So the conclusion uses the word unlikely. And LSAT cares a lot about those kinds of words. They don't want us to go like too much further past the word unlikely into like Neverland. So let's check out these answers again. So B, contrary to early discussions, global warming is not the only factor affecting the frequency and intensity of tropical storms. So what I see here is that this sort of brings in this final sentence, highlighting that there are other factors, but it's kind of missing the actual intention of the conclusion, which is to say there's this thing that's unlikely to happen, and that is that global warming is unlikely to cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. And B doesn't really capture that. It doesn't come right out and say it's unlikely to cause more frequent storms. Instead, it's focusing more on support for why that would happen. So it's going a little bit outside of the conclusion into the realm of the premise, and therefore I'm going to give it an X. Answer choice D has some of those degree issues that I foreshadowed a second ago. So it says it will straight up negate the effect of global warming on the formation of tropical storms. D is going to get the X as well for two reasons. One is that this language of will negate is a little more intense than what we see in the argument. It says here it's likely to counteract, and will negate is just a bit more certain and strong. The second reason is similar to B. This kind of misses the boat on expressing the idea behind the conclusion, which is that it's not likely that global warming will cause more frequent and intense tropical storms. So the correct answer to this question is E. E does a nice job of not going beyond the main idea of the conclusion, which is this prediction of global warming causing more frequent tropical storms is not going to happen. It's a pretty good match for that. It also matches the intensity or degree in saying probably will not, which is pretty similar to unlikely. All right. I see a couple of great questions here. Let's check them out. Arushi, yeah, the conclusion needs to be 100% the author's opinion, nobody else's. And I absolutely can explain why B is wrong again. So B talks mostly about what's happening in this part of the argument, this final sentence. And this is really a premise. It's a support. It's explaining why global warming will not lead to more tropical storms. But our conclusion is just the idea that global warming will not lead to more tropical storms. And then the rest of this is just a different part of the argument. And the LSAT's very literal, so they just want the conclusion, what's the main idea that we're trying to prove here. Okay, let me check the chat for any additional. Okay, good question, Debra. Can I explain again why we are not to summarize the argument? Absolutely. Because when we try to summarize the argument, a lot of times what we'll do is here, I'm going to clear this off. We'll try to put together all of the information that we read, and we'll look for an answer that talks about warm ocean surfaces and this prediction, but it's wrong. And here are the reasons, the wind flow, and we're looking for an answer that touches everything. And that might lead us to choose one of these other answer choices that talks about warm ocean surfaces or all the different factors. And that's just not our job on this particular question. When we're asked to find the conclusion, our job is, and just what the LSAT is asking us for is, what is that one sentence that is sort of the final thing the author's trying to prove here? And so trying to summarize leads us to include a lot of parts of the argument that are not the conclusion and makes us more likely to get this wrong. Okay, I hope that is helpful. Keep the questions coming if there's anything else I can clarify. And we're gonna take a look now at a second type of question that falls in this structure family, for which the conclusion is also a VIP. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this question type before I put it up. So this question type is called determine the role. And what you're going to see is an argument similar to the one we just saw. Rather than asking you explicitly for the conclusion, the question is going to say, what part does the quote, blah, blah, blah. It's going to have a quote from the argument in there. play in this argument, or what role does it play? And so it's possible when I look back at this argument that the blah, blah, blah is going to be the actual conclusion of this argument. But it might also be a supporting premise. It might be background information. It might be an intermediate conclusion, which we'll talk more about in a minute. It might be an opposing point. And so in order to figure out its role, the first step that I need to take on these question types is to identify what the actual conclusion is, that VIP conclusion. And the reason for that is once I know what the conclusion is, it becomes easier to sort everything else. Okay, so if the conclusion is sentence 3, then this quote is providing support, so it's a premise. Or this quote is going against the conclusion, so it's an opposing point. So we sort of name things in accordance to what they do or don't do for the conclusion. So when I see this question stem on an LSAT question, I typically kind of, I'm like, okay, I know what question type this is, and then I actually forget about this blah, blah, blah part. I don't even look for it while I'm reading. And I just go back to looking for the conclusion. Because if I just find the blah, blah, blah part, I'm going to know what it says, but I'm not going to know its relationship or its role in the rest of the argument. So let's give this a shot with a new question. Here it is. I'll give you 2 minutes again, and then I'll put the poll back up. All right, that's 2 minutes, so I will launch a new poll, and you can go ahead and let me know what you're thinking on this one. All right, thank you. Thanks for the high participation in this poll. It looks like we are collectively torn between a few answer choices. And it looks like our indecision actually revolves around what the conclusion of this argument is. So let's start our conversation there. Just like last time, I'm going to ask you to share with me in the chat the first 3 words of the sentence that you think the conclusion is. Cool. So I'm seeing entirely references to this final sentence. So jazz consists, and that is indeed the conclusion. Yeah, Arushi's pointing out also the first sentence looks kind of like it's part of the conclusion too, right? The phrase "the best" is kind of opinionated, and it does have some support. So this is a good learning opportunity about something that LSAT does to make these questions a little bit harder. And it's called the intermediate conclusion. So some arguments are pretty simple, like the one I gave you when we were first starting out. Allie needs a new quarantine hobby, therefore she should get a pet salamander. But some arguments have more steps to them. And a way I could make that argument I gave you at the beginning a little more complex is to add one more step to it. So I could say, Allie has been feeling bored, therefore she should get a new quarantine hobby, therefore she should get a pet salamander. And now all of a sudden this argument has 3 parts, and those parts are a premise, an intermediate conclusion, and a final conclusion, or a main conclusion is what we call it. And the idea of an intermediate conclusion is, it is something that's an opinion, and it is something that receives support. So she should get a new hobby as an opinion, and it's supported by the idea that I've been feeling bored. But it also provides support to a final conclusion, in this case that I should get a pet salamander. And final conclusions are selfish, remember, they don't give support to anything. So whenever we see something that looks like a conclusion, but also actually supports something else, that is what we call an intermediate conclusion. And the LSAT likes to distinguish those from final or main conclusions. So one of the things that's tricky about this argument in particular is that it has an intermediate conclusion. So we have 2 sort of conclusion contenders here. We want to think about which one of these seems like it's the final conclusion and which one is providing support for it. In this case, this first statement highlighted in green, that the best jazz singers use their voices as much as horn players use their instruments, is something that helps build to this argument that jazz consists of voice-like horns and horn-like voices. It provides support for it. So I could sort of draw out this argument into 3 parts again. We've got this example of Billie Holiday and of jazz horn players. Those 2 examples are providing illustrations of how the jazz singers use voices in the same way that horn players use instruments. And that statement is used to support this final general conclusion about jazz, that jazz consists of voice-like horns and horn-like voices. Say that 5 times fast. And so why does this matter? Well, if we go back to what the question is asking us, we're asking us, what is this claim that the best jazz singers use their voices? much as horn players use their instruments. What is that doing? So we've identified it as an intermediate conclusion. And that's really helpful because that means it's not the final or main conclusion. And that allows us to get rid of a couple of answers that were pretty popular in the poll. So answer choices A and B both refer to this as the main conclusion or the only conclusion when that's actually this final sentence. And that is really why it's so important to find the conclusion. That's why I call it the VIP, because it helps us in this case to kind of sort everything else out and eliminate some answer choices. So the correct answer to this one is actually answer choice C, because this is a statement that we do get some evidence for from these two examples, but then it is also used to provide evidence for this final conclusion. And then I'll just briefly discuss why we would eliminate the last two and then take a look at the chat. So it's not a statement for which no evidence is provided because we are given these two examples in the middle. And it is a statement used to support a conclusion that is in turn used to support the main conclusion. That's kind of how I would describe the Billie Holiday statement and the jazz horn player statement, is that they support a conclusion that supports a conclusion. It's describing a premise, but not the part of the argument that we are looking at. All right, so correct answer is C. Let me see what folks are saying in the chat. Okay, what again is a conclusion in an argument? Good question. So a conclusion in an argument, I'll put a couple notes off to the side here, is the final point that an author is trying to prove. So a potentially debatable opinion that the author is trying to prove. Note that that's different from a traditional conclusion in like an essay or a book where the conclusion is often just like the summary or the last sentence, the parting remarks. That's not a conclusion in the LSAT. A conclusion in the LSAT is a point that we want to prove. John asked, is provide support synonymous with provides evidence in LSAT language? Yes, it is synonymous. Green, okay. Deborah, you called me out on my poor use of color coding. I was not consistently using green. So this green highlight here is the part in question, which we decided is an intermediate conclusion. And then here I just was kind of coincidentally using the green highlight again to mark what we were looking for. E is wrong because it is describing the premise of the argument. So it's saying a statement used to support a conclusion. So that would be like this Billie Holiday statement supports this conclusion about jazz singers, but then supports this conclusion about jazz. So it's describing this portion of the argument and not the portion of the argument that we're looking for, which is this first sentence here. Will they ever try to trick you and use so for a premise? What a good question, Deanna. Totally, they'll try to trick you. They can't use so for something that is just a premise because so is a word that connects something to support for it. So they could use the word so to set up an intermediate conclusion, and they love to trick people that way. So one thing they might do, for example, is switch the order of these two sentences around and use so the best jazz singers use their voices, etc., but to have the conclusion actually be up at the top and not have the word so next to it. They do that a lot in arguments where they'll have like thus or therefore at the bottom, but it's actually an intermediate conclusion and not the final conclusion. They just won't do it with a premise. Okay, cool. Nice work, everybody. Wonderful questions. Yes, so the difference between an intermediate and final conclusion is that the intermediate conclusion provides support for the final conclusion, but the final conclusion doesn't provide that support back. So if you look at the pet salamander example, saying I should get a new hobby supports the idea that I should get a pet salamander. But that's not reciprocal. Like, I wouldn't say I should get a pet salamander and that's why I need a new hobby. So a final conclusion is like the last step in the chain of logic, the final point I'm trying to prove. And the intermediate conclusion is this like sort of point I need to prove along the way to help me prove my final point about the pet salamander. By the way, I'm accepting name ideas for my pet salamander. If anyone has them. I don't have a pet salamander yet. But. All right, so if that wasn't fun enough, I'm going to give you now a same type of question, but more difficult variety. And by the way that you can tell that this is a more difficult question is from where it comes in the logical reasoning section. So this is question number 21. Generally, questions like 17 to 23 or so tend to be the hardest part of the logical reasoning section from a statistical performance standpoint. And so that is an indication often that you either should slow down and really take your time with these questions, and or that there might be a couple of these that you want to skip in favor of ones that are not quite as daunting. So here's a nice tricky one, a nice challenge for everybody. Take 2 minutes, give it a try. Okay, that's been 2 minutes. So let me get a poll going for you. All right. So I'm definitely seeing reflected in the answers that this is the hardest question we've done. I see kind of a 3-way split between 3 of the answers, about 30% of us choosing each of those answers. So thank you all for your participation there and for giving this challenging question an attempt. And let's see what we can learn from it. So one last time, please tell me in the chat, what are the first 3 words of the part of this that you see as the conclusion? And I know it's just one long sentence, so just give me the first 3 words of the phrase. Cool. So it looks like there's a lot of consensus around this first portion. To explain the causes of cultural phenomena, a social scientist needs data about several societies. I agree with that. But I see some folks are also thinking about the latter portion as a possible conclusion. So let me provide some clarity on how we know this is conclusion. And this is actually really straightforward. So the reason I know this second part is not a conclusion is from this phrase, for example. For example, always indicates a premise. And so when I see that phrase, it means it's providing support, generally for whatever was the big idea that came before it. So that's a really helpful indicator in this case that this is the conclusion. And that's great because this part's really long and confusing. And they're kind of letting me off the hook at first for really understanding it because they're actually just asking, what is the role of this claim that we've highlighted in green? And we're like, great, we know it's the conclusion. So what I would do at first is say, all right, what can I do with just that information? If I just know this is the conclusion, I'm not sure what the heck the rest of this says. How well can I narrow this down? So I'm going to do this 2 different ways. I want you to see what I would do if I were super pressed for time, found this question really confusing and hard to access, and just wanted to move on. And then I also want to show you how I would approach this if I were really committing. So let's start with the first sort of mindset. Let's say I'm at question number 21 and I'm notified there's 5 minutes left. I see that I've got 4 more questions in this section. And this one is really hard for me. Like I read it and it sounded like gibberish. But I do know that first sentence is the conclusion. So here's how I would approach it in that situation. I would say, all right, I'm not going to get too bogged down on this. Let me eliminate some easy answers. I know, for example, that this is not a premise, it's the conclusion. That's the only one that's an easy elimination on this. So then I'm going to go with something that most closely matches my prediction. It's not clear to me that this is a problem or a dilemma. So I would say it's probably either a hypothesis or a claim. And it seems of those 2 closest to a claim. So I would pick E and I would move on from this question pretty quickly. And I would get this question right because the answer is E. But I'd be taking a lot of chances along the way. Like you notice I only read the first 3 words of every answer choice. So in an ideal situation, I get to number 21. I've allocated my time really wisely and I have 2 full minutes to tackle this question. So I can actually sit with some of the challenging language that I see here and investigate it. In that case, I would still eliminate B right away because I know this is not a premise. And I would save time by not reading all of B because there's no way it's going to be right if the first 3 words are it is a premise. But I would attend to the rest of these and give them their due consideration because I don't actually feel super comfortable just eliminating things based on the first 3 words in this particular case. So we'll start with A. It describes a problem. So I'm like, problem, is it really a problem? Like it's saying what they need to do, but it's not saying that it's bad or harmful in any way. So I got a question mark about that word. That the philosopher claims is caused by social scientists' need for certainty. So they do talk about being sure, but there's never, and they talk about needing data, but I don't see this like need for certainty. So I'm pretty doubtful about this one and I would cross it off. I already crossed off B. All right, C, it is a general hypothesis. So again, kind of like with the word problem, I don't love the word hypothesis here because this doesn't really sound like a theory that needs to be proven or like a guess that we're speculating about. it's more of a description of what is known about social scientists. So I'm not loving that. It's illustrated with an example showing that there is a causal relationship between political structures and environmental conditions. Okay, so here again, I have two options. This is complicated. And in order to eliminate or choose C, I'm gonna have to really be sure I have to investigate what they're saying in this. And I might decide that I wanna do that. I wanna go ahead and understand what they're saying down here and how does it relate to what's expressed here in C. Or I might defer and say, I'm gonna look for an answer that looks stronger, and I'll come back and revisit this if I want to. So for now, I'm gonna defer because I think that's what I would do in the real test situation. So D, it's a dilemma. I have the same concern about the word dilemma that I do about problem, which is like a dilemma implies that we sort of are in a bind where there's like two competing priorities or two things that we want to achieve that conflict with each other. And I don't see any sense of conflict in this conclusion, but I'll keep reading. Is faced by every social scientist. Ooh, okay. So my LSAT I has trained me to watch out for super strong language. I get excited when I see it because it's usually wrong. And I know this isn't every social scientist because this is talking about a particular situation where we want to explain the causes of cultural phenomena. And presumably that's not something that all social scientists do. So I'm going to cross this off and not read any more of it. And then E, it is a claim. I like that language. We know it's a claim that the philosopher attempts to justify. They do attempt to justify it by appeal to the requirements for establishing the existence of one kind of causal relationship. All right, so this is kind of similar to C. Now I'm down to C and E, and if I really want to be confident in my decision, I probably do need to go digging to understand exactly what this is saying. And I'll do it with a purpose. So I'm going to try to look at what's the difference between C and E so that I can try to figure it out. So E is saying it's an appeal to the requirements for how you establish a causal relationship. And C is saying there is a causal relationship between politics and environment. All right. So going back up here, one cannot be sure that a political structure is brought about by ecological or climatic factors unless one knows. So this sounds to me less like they're saying that there definitely is a causal relationship, and they're talking about how would we know if there is a causal relationship. So that sounds more like E, and that would lead me to a more thorough selection of E. All right, I see some comments in the chat. Cool. Can a conclusion be a dilemma on the LSAT? Totally. Yeah. It just would have to be a bit more, there'd have to be a bit more conflict in it in order for it to be a dilemma. For the last two questions, argument part questions. Yeah, that's one way to describe them. I call them determine the role, or you might see determine the function, but they're asking about parts of an argument, yeah. Deborah, the difference between those answer choices again and why C is wrong. Yeah, Deborah, which answer choices? I can go over why C is wrong. Oh, just between C and E. So there's two major differences. One is at the beginning in whether they call this a hypothesis or a claim. So a hypothesis is generally like a guess or a theory that needs to be proven in some way. And I don't know that this quite fits the bill of a hypothesis. So that casts a little doubt on it. Whereas a claim is like a conclusion or opinion. But the big difference here is that C is describing this support, the example, saying there is a causal relationship between political structures and environmental conditions, whereas E is saying they support this by appealing to the requirements for how we find a causal relationship. So when I go into this text, I'm trying to figure out, is this saying there is a causal relationship between political structures and environmental conditions, or is it talking about how you would figure that out? And it's talking about how you would figure that out. And I see a question, a relevant question about the word only in the stimulus. Is that enough to say that there's a causal relationship? So this is telling us, like, we can't be sure that a political structure is brought about only by these factors unless we know X, Y, or Z. So only is a strong word, but it's telling us right here that we don't know if the political structure was caused only by this stuff without knowing all of these other things about various societies that are similar or different. So this language of we cannot be sure unless helps me to understand that there's some uncertainty here rather than a clear claim that there is a causal relationship. It's talking about here's what we still need to know. That unless indicates I still need to know something in order to establish this causal relationship. Love that question, Deanna. That's a great one to close on. Should you be able to get this right in a minute and 20 seconds? I wouldn't say that that's the expectation, no. I would say for these harder questions, typically you would want to have longer than that to get these questions right. And that minute and 20 seconds is an average amount of time to spend on a logical reasoning question. But in an ideal situation, there would be some questions where you spend less time, which would allow you to spend more time on harder questions like this. All right, we have come to the end of our hour. So before we part ways, let me just thank you all for coming and for being such a wonderfully participatory group. This was a lot of fun for me. We have a bunch of different upcoming LSAT classes that you can check out on our website if you'd like to attend one of those for free. And you can also watch some more of these sessions on YouTube. And I see a couple of other questions that I'll address before we go. Do I think there will be LSAT Flex in the summer? You know, I probably shouldn't speak on the record about that, Arushi, because it would just be a total guess. I don't have any special relationship with LSAC that would give me more knowledge about that than you do. So I'm going to be watching the news like everyone else and keeping an eye on what they do. The crunch time classes, Deborah, are for people who are just about to take the test. And they are a very rapid review of every piece of content on a given subject. So like everything in logical reasoning or everything in logic games, for example. And they also kind of assume that you're familiar with Manhattan Prep's general lingo and style. So they wouldn't be appropriate for someone who's just starting out with study, but would be appropriate with someone who's like used our books, used our Interact, or taken our courses, and is taking the test soon. Thank you for the salamander wishes. Okay. Deborah, happy to chat with you more about your personal goals. That sounds like a more in-depth conversation. So if you want to email me with some more thoughts and questions, I'll put my email on the screen and you're welcome to reach out. All right. Awesome. Thank you all so much. I'm going to head out now. Have a lovely evening and good luck with your studies.